RadSite's webinar 2020 RadSite Standards and Accreditation Update. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation will be recorded, and an email containing the link will be sent to all registered participants early next week. To minimize noise and distraction, all attendees' phones have been muted. However, if you have a question or comment during the presentation, we encourage you to submit it using the chat box section in the lower right of the webinar portal. We will do our best to address all questions and comments at the end of the presentation. I will now turn the presentation over to our moderator, Mark Casner, who is chair of the RadSite Accreditation Committee.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in these very unusual times. I know the folks on this call are practicing their social distance, and my guess is you are as well. Let me start by giving a brief introduction of our panelists today. For a more complete biography of any of the panelists, you're welcome to go to our website. So let me start with Garry Carneal, who is our president and CEO. He's a leading expert in healthcare, having researched, written, and published extensively on quality medical management, information technology, and regulatory trends. He has an established track record in helping trade associations, accreditation organizations, and other health-related businesses scale up nationally. During his career, Mr. Carneal has brought to market more than 20 accreditation programs, having been recognized by 45 states and 3 federal agencies. Dr. Siegel is an internationally recognized radiologist who serves as professor and vice chair at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Department of Diagnostic Radiology, as well as chief of radiology and nuclear medicine for the Veterans Affairs Maryland Healthcare System, both in Baltimore, Maryland. An extensive writer, having written more than 200 articles. He presents commentary around the world more than 1,000 times worldwide. Dr. Philip Patton is our Chief Physics Officer and the President and CEO of LBT Radiation Physics. Dr. Patton is a certified health physicist, a diplomat of the American Board of Radiology, a diplomat of the American Board of Science and Nuclear Medicine, and a licensed medical physicist. And finally, Julie Irons is our Manager of Accreditation. She helps manage all aspects of the applicant's experience from initial contact to application setup, review, and the awarding of the accreditation. She also manages the Accreditation Committee, which oversees the review and approval of all MAP applicants. And with that, we'll talk briefly about what the overview is for this afternoon. Garry will lead off with an overview of RadSite. We'll follow that with a MIPPA Accreditation Standards and Guide, version 3.0, a newer program of ours, Cone Beam CT MAP Standards and Guide, value-based purchasing initiatives, and then finally, future of imaging performance and quality. And as Julie indicated, we'll try to save a few minutes at the end for any questions that you have. And with that, I'll turn it over to Garry for an overview.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for your leadership as the chair of RadSite's Accreditation Committee. We really appreciate your ongoing contribution. As Mark alluded to, I've been in the accreditation business for over a couple decades, and I've had the good fortune to work on a lot of different accreditation programs, ranging from managed care accreditation programs to those related to technology and so on. And I do think that my 10-year journey with RadSite has been remarkable. RadSite has been an independent accreditation organization for 10 years. We'll be celebrating our 10th year anniversary this fall. But what most people don't know is that actually RadSite has a little bit longer history. RadSite got its start by working with a radiology benefit management company back in 2005, and did a really kind of cutting edge certification program online back starting in 2005 up through 2010, when RadSite made the decision as an independent organization just to focus on accreditation. But during that earlier journey, we had the privilege and experience to have certified, reviewed over 60,000 pieces of low-tech and high-tech equipment in 25,000 different locations. And that has really given us a breadth and depth of experience that is really quite unique. And so as part of our mission in accreditation to build quality standards, we really try to make sure we have high fidelity standards and that they're carefully calibrated for each particular issue, and that we listen to our stakeholders, the companies we accredit, payers, and others about feedback in terms of the best way to continue to establish our standards. Today, we're in the process of diversifying, as you'll be hearing more about today from Dr. Siegel and Dr. Patton and others. We have basically 3 existing accreditation programs related to advanced diagnostic imaging, related to CT, MRI, and nuclear medicine. And as Mark alluded to, we're going through a beta test cycle right now to launch our new dental and medical cone beam CT standards, which is very exciting. And as Dr. Siegel will talk about a little bit more, we have some additional specialty modules just around the corner. But part of RadSite's governance is very, very key to making sure we're staying on track. Julie, next slide. We have 4 or 5 separate committees made up of 50 different volunteers. We have a board of managers, which basically is a board of directors that oversees the financial integrity of the company. We have 2 standards committees, one, the traditional MIPPA standards committee, which has been meeting for over 10 years. And we have the cone beam CT standards committee, which has been meeting over 2 years developing the new standards. And then Mark and Julie's committee, the accreditation committee. We also have an internal quality assurance committee to ensure things such as inter-rater reliability and some other activities. One of our taglines on our website is that we're Accreditation Reinvented. And one of the things I take pride in is I think during my career, I've overseen the accreditation of probably over 5,000 different organizations. And we really try to eliminate kind of unnecessary bureaucracy and really focus on providing feedback loops to really help whatever market segment we're focused on to move to the next level. And that means that we embrace innovation. We do things such as inter-rater reliability testing, and we do connect with different stakeholders from all walks of life to make sure that we have all the data points we need to do the very best job that we can. But one of the aspects of accreditation is really the notion of quality measurement. And as you may be aware, there's kind of 3 different types of buckets within that journey. You have structure measures, process measures, and outcome measures. And just to remind us, structure measures give consumers and patients a sense of a healthcare provider's capacity, the systems, and processes to provide high quality care. Process measures indicate what a provider does to maintain or improve health, either for healthy people or those diagnosed with a healthcare condition. And finally, outcome measures reflect the impact of the healthcare services or intervention on the health status of patients. And it's really the combination of those 3 kind of variables that come into play to make a successful accreditation program. And as you'll hear, we're just not accepting the status quo, but we're really trying to reinvent accreditation going forward as we move to future standards. And you'll hear a little bit more about that today. But specifically regarding the MIPPA accreditation program, our standard milestones, we did, as I said, RadSite began in 2005, and then we moved to, we launched version 1.0 of the standards. Next slide, Julie. And we developed version 2.0, which ended up being approved by CMS. We became the 4th recognized accreditation body under MIPPA in 2013. And in 2015, we announced version 2.2. And what you're going to hear about a little bit today is version 3.0, which we finalized late last year. And we'll give you some updates on version 3.1, which have been drafted and are going through final tweaking. We continue to do everything we can to optimize experience. We've made some updates to the RadSite online portal. We've talked a little bit about the cone beam CT accreditation program, which among other things includes the first set of uniform measurements for physics, that we're working on. And again, as I mentioned, version 3.1 of the standards, which focus, among other things, on the specialty guidelines. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Siegel, who can tell us a little bit about some of the changes we made from version 2.2 to 3.0. Dr. Siegel?
Great. Yeah, well, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Gary. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, say and express appreciation for the Standards Committee that has been meeting on a monthly basis and consists of volunteers with a tremendous amount of experience and expertise in medical imaging. And so the Standards Committee now has version 3.0 of the RadSite standard, which is just gone live on the portal. And so what are some of the changes that are associated with the 3.0 version of the standards? Well, the first few are within the realm of CT. And so the Standards Committee decided that at this point in 2020 that we really ought to set a minimum number of channels or slices for CT. So the minimum number of slices now is a 4-channel or 4-slice scanner for a CT moving forward to qualify for accreditation. If a site is doing CT angiography, runoff type studies, renal angiography, or other CT angiographic procedures, then the minimum would be a 16-channel or 16-slice system. And for coronary artery CT, the minimum configuration would be a 64-channel scanner. And so whenever a particular site is submitting images, there's always a clinical review and feedback to the site. So these minimums really are the cutoffs that we have, but in addition, even if one meets those standards, one also needs to be able to have images that will pass the radiologist reviewer and also have a scanner that would pass the physics reviewer. The other requirement for CT is a dual injector for those sites that are doing coronary artery CT imaging. With regard to what's new for the 3.0 standard for MRI, there's a requirement now for using a dedicated MR breast coil for any of the sites that are doing breast MRI examinations. I think this has become the community standard, and certainly the Standards Committee believes that strongly as well. The other change has been in qualifications, and so one of the modifications now is that all CT studies interpretations in the 3.0 standard must be done by either an MD or a DO. Additionally, there are experience and other requirements for those who are doing specific cardiac CT or cardiac MR interpretation. And those standards apply to radiologists or cardiologists or nuclear medicine physicians who are interpreting cardiac studies. Additionally, there has been expansion of the imaging protocol recommendations that are included in the standards manual. There have been several refinements to the physics measurement requirements. And the 3.0 version also contains some clarification on some time frame requirements as well. Next slide, please. So what's in the 3.1 version? Well, the 3.1 version concentrates and has as its additional refinement subspecialty submodules. And so one of the things that had been pointed out in the past is that there are advantages, particularly with some payers and others, to being able to be additionally certified for subspecialty modules. And so in addition to submitting cases for CT for general approval, which is what RadSite has been doing up until now, at the 3.1 version of the standards, there's also the ability to apply for subspecialty certification in particular areas. This meets requirements of some of the payers and actually allows us to have subspecialist radiologists be able to provide feedback on particular subspecialties that are done by sites that are doing CT, MRI, nuclear medicine, and PET. And so for CT, those areas include angiography, body imaging, cardiac imaging, maxillofacial, musculoskeletal, and neurologic. For MRI, also there's MR angiography, MRI body, MRI breast imaging, and we already talked about the requirement now for dedicated breast coil, MRI cardiac, MRI functional imaging, such as diffusion tensor imaging, for example, musculoskeletal imaging in MR, neurologic MRI, so neuro-MR, and pediatric MRI is also. And with regard to nuclear medicine, there are subspecialty modules for pediatric nuclear medicine, cardiac nuclear medicine in general. Within PET, it's divided into 5 categories: cardiac, PET imaging for infection, PET imaging for neurologic disorders, oncology PET imaging, which we would imagine would be the largest category of what people are doing, and pediatric. So one still has the ability to be able to get a general accreditation for a CT scanner, MRI scanner, or nuclear medicine system, but there's also the opportunity to be able to get these subspecialty clinical accreditations as well. Next, please. One other exciting development has been the addition of cone beam standards, and this is really the first refinement that the Standards Committee has had to cone beam CT. As you all probably know, cone beam CT, up until fairly recently, has sort of been a wild west as far as issues and challenges associated with uniformity, determining what actually represents a quality image with cone beam CT, and even measuring radiation dose. There are so many different ways that they're measured. And so there are a number of challenges associated with cone beam. And although up until now, there hasn't really been a distinction that's been made from a clinical perspective or physics perspective on unique requirements for cone beam CT in comparison with conventional CT, the 1.0 version and 1.2, and then the 2.0 versions essentially add those additional specifications. The cone beam CT standards have been under development for 2 years, and we're currently beta testing a number of applicants for that utilizing the 1.0 standard. When is the launch of cone beam CT? We anticipate that should be early summer. The dental and medical standards are being developed, and then there are subspecialty areas within cone beam CT. And so, as you all know, cone beam CT scanners, probably the majority of them currently, are dental scanners. There's a huge number, many thousands of those that are out there currently. There's also cone beam applications for ENT, predominantly sinus CT, but a number of other ENT applications, maxillofacial cone beam CT, orthopedic cone beam CT. There are more and more of our radiology and orthopedic and other colleagues who are utilizing cone beam CT for musculoskeletal imaging, particularly the ability to create 3D and multiplanar images, and cone beam CT for pediatric applications, and cone beam CT for podiatry. So in version 1.0, RadSite is accepting the manufacturer's phantom testing. In other words, if you buy a scanner from a particular manufacturer, then we will accept being able to pass that manufacturer's own testing recommendations and process. The challenge, of course, is that if you had a manufacturer that was suboptimal, then they may also have a suboptimal testing process and a relatively lower standard. One of the big challenges in cone beam CT has been the lack of a uniform standard as we have in conventional CT across all the different systems. This would allow us to be able to compare performance from one system to the other, which we really can't do because each one of the cone beam systems currently has its own phantom and its own methodology for testing. But what we really strongly believe, and the Standards Committee strongly believes is important, is having something that cuts across all of the different cone beam standards and something that would allow us to be able to make a determination of how one would actually compare with the other. So in version 2.0, then there is a uniform phantom that will be available for testing and comparison across multiple different systems. Next slide, please. So Phil, did you have any additional comments about any of the things that I talked about, or cone beam, or any of the new physics testing requirements in the later versions of the standards?
You covered most of it. However, I was going to point out one of the reasons that it took so long to come up with version 1.0 was to determine how we were going to handle evaluating the system with looking at additional information other than clinical images. And as you pointed out, the manufacturer recommendations are very different from one vendor to another. And a uniform set of parameters was hard to obtain initially. So with creating a standard phantom that we can apply to each vendor, then we will be able to have a more concise set of standards that we can evaluate other than just the clinical images.
Thanks, Phil. And Mark, I'm going to kick it back to you to lead us through a walkthrough of the standards.
Thanks, Eliot. And I'm going to have a brief sojourn here. I think, as you can see, you can read the smaller print here, the manual itself is nearly 100 pages long. It's a rather extensive standards, but we wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the process that folks go through. So I'm going to immediately flip it over to Julie to talk about accreditation requirements.
All right, well, thank you. On this slide, we talk about how the standards are divided, and the standards are divided into 7 sections. And I'll talk about the first 6 sections. It's a tough word for me. In the first section, it's the imaging provider information. This covers the basic information about who the facility is, who you are, and what services your facility provides. We also determine if your imaging system is permanently located at your facility. The second section, imaging systems, is specific to the modality you are applying for. Here we're going to ask for general questions about your modalities, your system requirements, your regulatory requirements, and your protocol testing. The third section is professional qualifications, and this is where we ask about your staff and determine if they are who they are and what they say they are. How do you verify their credentials? This is what we want to know. We also want to see examples of those credentials. So this one's important about the key staff that are in your facility. The next section, the fourth section, is professional oversight. And here we want to review your staff's responsibilities. What is required of the staff in these key positions? The required documents you will be uploading here are corresponding job descriptions for the positions to tell us what their responsibilities are. The next section, Section 5, is about policies and procedures. And Section 6, quality and patient safety, focus on your organization's guidelines for the treatment of your patients and professional staff. The intent of these sections is to ensure your business and clinical decisions promote operational integrity, clinical efficiency, and patient safety. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Siegel again to explain the technical requirements for your images.
So thanks, Julie. With regard to technical requirements, the Standards Committee believes it's really important not only to have the qualifications of the facility, machine specifications, and also the other specifications that are required for a quality program, but also we believe it's important to review the images and the reports themselves And so we require for all of our sites submission of clinical images and clinical reports. And so there are standards for the general technical evaluation of those imaging studies and the reports, specific standards for CT image quality, MRI, and nuclear medicine, and then standards for corrective action for imaging system deficiencies. The appendix, there's Appendix G, which has CT protocol samples, H, which has MRI protocol samples for image quality assessment, Appendix I, nuclear medicine, and then there is Appendix J, K, and L, which are the scoring sheets that the radiologists who are subspecialists in their area end up scoring for the variety of different types of studies. And in scoring, we look for whether or not the study is indicated based on the indication in the report, whether it's the appropriate study or not, and then evaluate multiple parameters about the study itself, looking at whether or not the right area was included and the entire area that should have been included in, say, a CT of the lumbar spine was included, meaning the lower portion of the thoracic spine, maybe upper portion of sacrum, or for a chest CT, we might look to see where the image starts and ends, and looking at things such as field of view and many other parameters. And then just overall, after looking at the image quality from a radiologist perspective, also looking at the report. In the past, there have been reports where, or cases where we've actually had the radiologist made additional findings that they thought were important and then fed that back to the clinical site. We've also had radiologists who have looked at the images and come up with suggestions for improvement in the image acquisition, and then feed that back also. And so in general, this review is very much in keeping with the philosophy of RadSite to educate and to provide feedback to users, and to do that in as constructive a way as possible. And so that represents the radiologist review. And then Phil, do you want to talk a little bit about the physics technical review as well?
Sure. So on the physics side, CMS has kind of set the standard where all the accrediting bodies have to have some form of physics evaluation, and kind of set the goal for there. So what we have done is we require a set of images for each modality, and they're outlined in our standards. And from those, we're able to assess what we think the quality of the machine is, and give feedback where we think it's not appropriate, and have the facility address that and then resubmit images. So for example, CT, CMS has dictated we should be able to evaluate the dose for one, and make sure the dose is appropriate for different types of scans. We need to make sure that the uniformity of the images is appropriate, the low contrast resolution, high contrast resolution are appropriate, and there's a geometric accuracy involved. For MRI, it's very similar. We look at the low contrast, detectability, the high contrast resolution, uniformity, geometric accuracy, and et cetera. For nuclear medicine, again, very similar things are evaluated. We're looking at, again, low contrast and high contrast. The goal there, as you can see for each modality, we're basically assessing the quality of the machine for those particular protocols. Now, the machine may be a great machine, and the protocol may be substandard for the imaging that we're looking at, or the machine may have a deficiency. We actually score those, give a feedback, and dictate what we felt was not appropriate. Sometimes we think it's appropriate, but we also give suggestions of what could be better. And then that gives the facility the opportunity to improve their particular protocols, especially when it comes to CT and dose to the patient, or when we're looking at very, very hard to detect objects in the low contrast range. We can give feedback that maybe can help with the low contrast detectability. Our scoring sheets are in Appendix C through F, and they're pretty self-explanatory. Next slide.
Okay, so thank you, Eliot and Phil. As you can see, there's a long process before it even gets to the accreditation committee. And like Eliot, I want to thank my committee members. We meet once a month virtually to review all of the applicants. And a couple of important things here. As we review these applications, number one, they're all blinded, so we don't know which facility is submitting that application. I think that just gives us a much more objective viewpoint. The other thing that happens within that committee, and it's comprised of experts in radiology, physicians, et cetera, so we're really getting a pretty composite view as we review these things. But as we raise questions through that process, we subsequently go back to Dr. Siegel's committee. Maybe we need to fine-tune some of our protocols. Maybe we need to take a look at updating things based upon some of the reviews that happen in the accreditation committee. So that linkage happens frequently throughout the year. Once we get through all this, it is a 3-year process. We do work closely with all of our applicants. If there is an issue either on the administrative side or the clinical side, we want to work with those facilities to make sure they meet our standards. So if there's an initial fail, we go back with a corrective measure, allow them the opportunity to do that, and then resubmit. And again, for us, it's a true partnership between us and all of the facilities. There is an appeal process. If we fail, I can tell you in the years that I have been leading the accreditation committee, we've not had an appeal. So we've been able to successfully get all of our applicants through that process. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Julie.
All right, thank you. So this is the accreditation portal. It is a streamlined process, cloud-hosted, user permissions, as you can read. So the first stage of course, always of any application is to, create a user account and log in. So, but there are 4 stages to the portal. It is the preliminary stage, the in-process stage, the under review stage, and then the accredited stage. In the preliminary stage, that's where you do create the application. The next stage is the meat of the application. In there are 5 tabs that will need your attention. The first 2 tabs have questions about the facility and your technologist. Next, you will upload your required documents, and there is a document checklist available, but you'll also find them throughout the standards. We do have specific questions about your imaging system, and on the last tab is where you will upload your clinical images, corresponding reports, as well as your phantom images and your physics report. The application can be completed in order or over several sessions, so you can start and stop as necessary. In preparation to starting the process, we can provide you with our portal tutorial and the document checklist. We can also provide you with the 2 agreements that you'll need at the start of the process, our MAP agreement and our HIPAA BA agreement. The checklist that I can provide you, and you can also get it through the portal, puts all the required documents and examples of what we require in one place with references back to the standards. There is also a tab in the portal for resources, and you can get all those documents there at any time. Once the application is completed, you will submit it for review. The application manager will review it for completeness and then assign it to the 3 reviewers, the admin reviewer, the image reviewer, which is our radiologist, and the physics reviewer, which is our physicist. If there are any deficiencies, as Mark previously said, we will notify you with an RFI, a request for information, and reopen the application to you. You will then be able to review the issues and make any necessary edits or updates. And if you look, you can see the preliminary tab, the facility tab, the technologist tab, the documents tab, the scanner tab, and the studies tab. And when everything is complete, you'll get this 100% and the submit application button. Once your application is approved by all 3 reviewers, an executive summary, which is blinded, as Mark said, is created and presented to the Accreditation Committee. Once the AC, or the Accreditation Committee, passes your application, you will receive an approval letter and certificate. Your facility will also be listed in our online directory. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. My information is on the website. All right, and there's a copy of what the current certificate looks like. All right, so Garry, I'm going to pass this on to you.
Well, thank you, Julie. One of the more fascinating aspects of accreditation from a public policy perspective is really kind of the multidimensional oversight of imaging practices in other areas of healthcare. Because, of course, in addition to accreditation standards, you have regulations, you have professional standards, that kind of set forth evidence-based pathways. And then also you have purchasing criteria, which plays a big role. And these kind of come together and sometimes have different, different focuses, different levels. And so part of what RadSite is trying to do is standardize best practices where we can. And so as we kind of grow and expand, we have probably a handful of strategic initiatives we're working on. And Dr. Siegel and I are going to feature 2 today, so I'm going to take the first one. We're working with the National Alliance for Healthcare Purchasing Coalitions, which is one of the 2 larger employer groups. They represent a consortium of over 50 state purchasing coalitions made up of most of the largest companies in the country and smaller ones too. And they've really been able to do some tremendous work over the years in terms of identifying issues, addressing different areas. Recently, they worked on, for example, drug formularies, mental health, and other topics. And one of their initiatives is a project called Evaluate, which I think is probably the largest request for information for health plans in the country. So once a year, they send out a survey question set to the health plans to basically kind of get feedback and then begin to structure kind of potentially what the standards would be for a new issue. And I just cited 2 recent examples. They issued reports recently on drug formularies and mental health. And we're excited that this year, the Evaluate work group is focusing on imaging quality. So we've begun to meet monthly. We had a face-to-face meeting that kicked things off last November, and we're beginning to discuss, potential metrics that could be folded into the RFI, later become an RFP, which would include imaging exam metrics, quality and clinical care metrics, imaging service metrics, and performance-based contracting metrics. And of course, this kind of is framed in kind of value-based purchasing, but also is focused on the different stakeholders. What payers should be doing, for example, in terms of the utilization management program. What are the duties and responsibilities of the ordering, positioning, the rendering imaging provider, et cetera. So we're well on our way of picking kind of the question set that's going to go out. And when this is all done, hopefully there'll be a report issued. And then what will happen is that these kind of new kind of emerging thoughts will be folded into future RFP requirements, mostly from the private sector, and then hopefully picked up through some of these other regulatory and governing bodies. So it's exciting to kind of hear the discussion, the different perspectives, and really try to zero in on 3 or 4 top priorities that we can focus on. So if you're interested in learning more about Evaluate, please send an email to my attention. You can use the info@radsitequality.com email off our website, and I'll be happy to share with you a little bit more about that. And if you want to get involved, we would encourage you to get involved as well. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Siegel to talk about the RSNA initiative.
Thanks, Garry. So, as we're constantly trying to ask ourselves the question, how can accreditation be relevant to actually having a significant impact on patient care? And, we look at the equipment and look at trying to make sure that doses are adequate and that overall image quality is acceptable also. But one of the questions is, how does one take it to the next level? And so we have had an ongoing dialogue and tremendous interest from an initiative that was started by the Radiologic Society of North America that actually involves an increasing number of vendors, industry, and a number of other healthcare professionals. They're actually asking the question, what is it that we are looking at or measuring when we do a examination on a patient? For example, you can have a pretty good quality CT scan of the thorax on two different machines from two different institutions, have both of them look good, but when you make a measurement on a lesion, it may be that there's a discrepancy. Maybe one measures a mass at 2.5 centimeters, another at 2.7 centimeters, for example, as far as the size or volume. And there are discrepancies from one system to the other. The question is, is a system actually measuring something in a patient that is reproducible? If a patient goes to another CT scanner at the same institution or another a month later, and there's been a change in the apparent size that's reported or the SUV value on a PET scan for metabolic activity, is that a real change related to the patient's radiation therapy or chemotherapy, or is it a difference in instrumentation? And so the KIBA initiative looks at mechanisms to be able to allow sites that are doing nuclear medicine, MRI, and CT to be able to make uniform measurements so that those measurements actually correspond with the physical reality in the patient and also would likely be reproducible on other machines. This has been a major issue in both research and clinical care that's increasingly being recognized. And so there's the potential to be able to have an additional accreditation that applies the additional requirements from the KIBA initiative to allow a site to say, not only are we, creating high quality images as far as a physics perspective and as far as a clinical perspective, but we're also creating data that is quantitative and is comparable to what one would expect with other similarly tuned scanners. And so it's a really exciting initiative, and we're in ongoing discussions with RSNA about trying to figure out how we can best become one of their accreditation sites for the KIBA program, which I think will be really important clinically and not just from a research perspective. So thanks, Garry. And so I guess with regard to the future of quality imaging, I've already started on that discussion with the KIBA discussion about having the instruments actually reflect the real values of volume, size, and SUV values, and also perfusion patterns, say on MRI. But the other question is it really representative of a site's quality when we look at just a small number of images that are submitted by the site? And with regard to image quality, wouldn't it be great to be able to have an ongoing quality program, something maybe more similar to what JCHO recommends, where one has the sites actually evaluating images on a regular basis, recording that, and then having a mechanism to be able to allow an accreditation organization to look at the records and the data from an ongoing process. And so can one utilize today's 2020 computer technology to be able to help in evaluation of images, recording of that, and then to have an ongoing process of quality assurance and quality improvement? And so as time goes on, we're looking at being able to potentially do real-time quality assessment, to leverage artificial intelligence technologies to be able to evaluate qualities of scans in a more quantitative way, and to sort of use much more evidence-based tools to be able to determine relative quality. So those are all things that we've been talking about internally. I think they're really exciting, and I think as time goes on, they will provide more information to allow us to provide the best possible quality for our patients. So, Phil, if you wanted to add anything, please do.
So, you know, I think we're always trying to evaluate how we can get better, especially on the physics side. This is happening where we're looking at different modalities. It's also looking at how we're evaluating each modality. So it's inevitable our standards will continue to evolve as the equipment evolves, and as we use modalities differently, we'll have to continue to implement new physics testing and new clinical evaluation to help ensure that the equipment is performing the task that it's meant to do. I'm kind of excited about where we're going to go with improving quality imaging in the future.
Okay, so RadSite is taking off. We have more than 350 payer recognitions to date, more than 200 imaging providers who have been accredited. As you can tell from the past 45 minutes or so, launching new standards, that's a constant with our group. Leading new value-based purchasing efforts, coordinating key public policy initiatives with national leadership groups, as Garry was talking about, best-in-class accreditation experience. I now invite anyone who has questions to submit them if you haven't already. And while we're waiting for some of those, I do have a few that I want to get started with. And Phil, I think I want to circle back to you because this is something that comes up quite often in the Accreditation Committee. So just talk to us a little bit more about the phantom protocols, especially as it relates to the new cone beam CT, et cetera. One of the questions that we hear often from our applicants is, can I use the phantom that comes with the piece of equipment? Do I have to have a specific phantom for accreditation and routine quality control? I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on that.
Sure. So one of the things that we've done that's different than other accrediting bodies is we've taken the approach of, can we evaluate what we need to evaluate as our metric? And so what I mean by that is currently we do not require a specific phantom for any modality, as long as the phantom you're using, we're able to evaluate that phantom. In other words, as long as there's documentation on that phantom and we can look through the phantom and see what it provides, and then from there we can verify that it allows us to evaluate the standards we need. In other words, can we look at high contrast resolution? Can we look at low contrast resolution? Can we look at uniformity? Or anything that modality has that we're going to evaluate. So in general, you can use a vendor-specific phantom as long as it does what we need it to do, and we have approved that phantom. And we have approved alternate phantoms than what other accrediting agencies have, especially in nuclear medicine. In CBCT, currently, we only use the vendor phantoms. We will be going to a standard phantom for CBCT only because we haven't been able to narrow the requirements down using the vendor phantoms. They are completely different in aspects. Some vendors evaluate completely different things and they have completely different standards. And so we're not able to come to a consensus. And so for CBCT, we will be in the next version be requiring a specific phantom. But currently in all of our modalities, CT, MR, and NucMed, we do not require a specific phantom. One of the other things that's nice about RadSite is if you submit some phantoms or clinical images and they do not meet the standard, in other words, you pick a phantom that does not allow us to evaluate everything we need to evaluate on the physics side, we will give that feedback to you, and you just have to correct it. You don't have to reapply. You don't have to submit additional funds. You just have to correct it, and then we'll reevaluate it. So we do that on all aspects. So there's a reduction in cost. There's a true partnership in getting the equipment to perform optimally.
Great. Thank you, Phil. So this next question is for Garry. It's kind of a complex two-parter, Garry. So over the last 45 minutes or so, again, we've talked about a number of improvements that have occurred. We're routinely reviewing our standards. We're routinely fine-tuning things. We're taking a look at new modalities like cone beam CT, subspecialty modules, et cetera. So, and so the second part of the question relates to that, which is there are 4 accrediting organizations that folks have an opportunity to choose from. And with what we've been talking about this afternoon and understanding what some of the other organizations do, tell us what begins to differentiate RadSite from some of the other folks that are out there.
Sure, thanks, Mark. You know, it's a privilege to be kind of in the accreditation space, and as you alluded to, the United States has a rich tradition in accreditation agencies supplementing regulations and RFPs, et cetera. One of the things I get excited about is really harmonizing kind of different standards into kind of a national standard and trying to work through the issues as to what is the proper way to calibrate the standard at a given point in time. Dr. Patton just alluded to the fact that we're going to take this kind of 2-step process, first using the cone beam CT manufacturers, phantoms, and then we were aware of at least 1 or 2 commercial phantoms are going to market that will kind of open the doors up for uniform measurement. So being able to kind of provide a leadership role in moving from kind of this ad hoc approach to a standard approach, which really allows an apples to apples comparison on, for example, ionizing radiation or the fidelity of an image is really exciting. But along that way, we have to stay true to kind of what we're trying to do. And that is ultimately our job is to improve population health. And so what we don't want to do is, again, kind of create our own bureaucracy and become, an expensive overlay to what imaging providers are doing today. So, I have great respect for our sister accreditation organizations out there, and we've learned a lot from them, and hopefully they've learned a lot from us. So I think part of it is aggregating all those best practices and then injecting it into kind of the accreditation experience. And this is the bottom line. I've been doing this for 22 years. As you mentioned, I've brought over 20 accreditation programs to market. And so we bring to the table with everybody on this webinar lots of experience to really make sure it's streamlined and appropriate. One of my favorite taglines is that over the years, again, I've helped oversee the accreditation of thousands of companies and organizations. And what I'd like to say is that no organization has gone through the accreditation process without at least making one substantive change. And so part of it is really kind of that educational loop. So when you bring that all together in this formula, it seems to kind of really build a best-in-class accreditation experience, knowing that we also have this trajectory of moving forward and trying to continue to innovate not only quality but performance with whatever field we're accrediting.
Great. Thank you, Garry. So we only have a couple of minutes left. I don't see any other questions that are out there. If you do, please quickly type them into the chat room. I want to thank our panelists.
Mark, this is Julie. There are 2 questions in the question slot.
Okay. Well, do you want to go ahead and read those since I'm not looking at that right now, Julie?
Sure. The first one is there any accommodation made for, quote, excellent image quality reflecting the dose needed to achieve the quality, that level of quality? How is that measured / qualified? He's talking CBCT here.
Which one of our panelists would like to jump on that one?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I 100% understand that question, but I think what the question is asking is there a metric to be able to look at the quality as a function of the amount of dose that is spent? And it's an area that I'm really interested in. In fact, I'm doing research on that particular topic with UCSF. And so what we'll be looking at on the Phantom will be the a mechanism to be able to determine what the actual dose is in a way where we can compare one system to the other. We'll be looking at the relative performances of one system versus the other. So what we should be able to do, if we can essentially derive a dose metric that would be equivalent for multiple different scanners, is it should allow us to do what I think you're asking, and that is to say, well, if you have a scanner that's delivering, really relatively low dose, let's document that your cone beam CT scanner can do that, and actually demonstrate that the image quality, as judged by the radiologists or the reviewers who are experts in that area, is good. So the accreditation committee will be able to get a feeling from Phil's report on the relative sensitivity of the scanner, which would predict its relative dose performance, and we'll also get an evaluation of the quality. So in many ways, we'll have that capability. I'd love to see something that you're implying, which would be a dose quality metric that would give you something that would be amount of quality per dose. And that's actually an artificial intelligence project that I'm working on currently, and would love to be able to apply to those types of images. So really interesting question. Thanks.
Okay, and the second, which is more of a comment, it's from John Miller. He is with the National Alliance, and he has a comment. We are excited about this venture. He's talking about the Evaluate venture that Garry mentioned. We are excited about this venture into educating purchasers about quality in the imaging field and helping them to begin to implement value-based principles in this field. He just talked with a benefits consultant who was on our standards committee, and he thanked me for including him, indicating that there is an appetite for the purchaser community for this project. So as Garry said, please contact him if you want more information about it.
And just real quickly, John Miller is the Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Business Group on Health, and is definitely a thought leader in this space. He's also the functional lead for Evaluate for the National Alliance. So we've been working under his supervision going forward on this initiative, and it's been a privilege to work with him over the past few months, and look forward to kind of continue to move forward with this project. And as he kind of reminded me in his comment, that this gets down to some of the fundamental questions as to what quality is and what performance is, which I think is a theme that has kind of emerged throughout this webinar, which of course also kind of reminds us why we're doing accreditation, right? We need to continue asking that question and not take anything for granted, and continue re-examining. I think, Mark, you mentioned, our standards development process has never been static. And every month we're dealing with a new issue or more, trying to, to perfect and better what we're doing in terms of our role as an accreditation body.
Great. Okay, well, that concludes our webinar for today. Again, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. We will have future webinars coming up here. We'll get announcements out on that. Julie, I don't know if you have any closing comments?
No, I don't.
Great. And so here on this last slide is how you can reach us. Please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and we look forward to your participation in future webinars.